just get started. Okay, so tonight we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Michael Shermer to the Science Enthusiast podcast. Dr. Shermer is the publisher of Skeptic magazine, a monthly columnist for Scientific American, and a presidential fellow at Chapman University, where he teaches Skepticism 101. He is the author of several books, including Why People Believe Weird Things, Why Darwin Matters, The Science of Good and Evil, and The Moral Arc. His next book is Heavens on Earth, The Scientific Search for the Afterlife, Immortality, and Utopia. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So I assume that most people who are watching this or listening are probably familiar with you and your work, but can you give a little bit first of your background and how skepticism became the subject for which you're so well known?
Right. Well, by way of background, there's the background. That's my office. and
all the books.
Like, here's just a sampling of books that have come in the last, 2 months for review. So, I mean, it's just a little overwhelming how many nonfiction books there are, particularly in the sciences. I mean, these are all pretty much science books in just the last, say, few months that have come in for review. So that's part of our job, is just finding the time to deal with all these things. It's a good problem to have, in a sense, because it's a sign that the popularity of science writing has increased enough that there's publishers who obviously feel there's a market for this many books. Yeah. And so I'd say that's real progress from, say, decades ago, when maybe I was in college and there were only a handful of popular science books that you could read. Otherwise, they were mostly technical. And so now there is something of a genre of books that are not only readable by the general public, but they're also original content by the author, the scientists. So, for example, my favorite example of this is Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, about why civilizations developed differentially over the last 13,000 years around the world. And that's not the popular version of his technical theory published in some journal or scholarly book. That's the only available edition, period. And there's a lot of books like that. Like a lot of Richard Dawkins' books are like that. Steven Pinker's books are like that. My books, I try to make them like that. So I think that's a good sign. So that's really kind of captures the answer to your question. Is we're trying to write, publish through Skeptic magazine and my books and through podcasts or whatever, content that is for everybody. And it's not just popularized versions of things, but it's the only versions. And our wheelhouse, as it were, is kind of the borderlands of science, or the margins of science, the fringes of science, or pseudoscience, pseudo-history, alternative medicine, alternative archaeology. In other words, if you take something like Scientific American, which I write a monthly column for, they would never, the other authors in there would never deal with the kinds of topics that we would deal with, like conspiracy theories or science and religion and things like that. They're covering more mainstream topics, and I would not bother with writing about CRISPR, the genetic the genetic technology, because that's already being covered by mainstream science writing. So we kind of have slightly separate worlds, and I got into that just by personal interest. I was always interested when I was studying science on the margins. What's the deal with creationism? Why don't they accept evolution? Yeah. And there, from there, it turns out there's a whole bunch of areas. And what I discovered in the 1980s, watching some debates between creationists and evolutionary biologists, is that the creationists were winning because the scientists thought it was a debate about facts and evidence, but that's not what's really going on with creationism. And unless you know what their real motives are, and then what arguments they're going to use to get people to join their side for their political or religious motives, then you don't know what's going on. So the scientist delves into the fossil evidence or whatever. creationist isn't interested in the fossil evidence, other than to swat it away so he can get to the, the point that he really wants to talk about. That you should accept Jesus. Anyway, so I mean, it takes.
You had said alternative. Was it paleontology or archaeology?
Archaeology, yeah. Archaeology.
What the hell is that? Like, that's a thing.
These are theories. Yeah, like I was just on Joe Rogan's podcast for almost 4 hours.
We will not keep you that long.
Yeah, with Graham Hancock, and now Graham is a famous author for searching for Atlantis. That would be an alternative theory of history. Of course, he doesn't think it's alternative. He thinks mainstream archaeology is too dogmatically closed-minded to evidence indicating this ancient lost civilization. In any case, but most mainstream archaeologists don't accept it because the evidence is not there for such a lost civilization. So they reject it. And there's hundreds of these kinds of things. Who really built the pyramids? How were they built? Who really discovered America? Not Columbus. And so, for example, a mainstream archaeological debate may be, when did the Native Americans, first humans, colonize the Americas? When did the Native Americans become Native Americans? And is it one wave, multiple waves? Did they come by land? Did they come by sea? And so on. The alternative archaeology people would have something completely different that they want to talk about. The Romans came here, or the lost tribe of the Jews came here, or ships from Africa came here to South America, and so on. So that's kind of how those things separate. And there's books about this. People that specialize, archaeologists that specialize in so-called alternative archaeology.
Wow. So there's an irrational belief for pretty much for
right.
everything, basically.
Well, it's interesting. The reason what we use it for science education is, well, how do archaeologists know anything about the past? What do they make their decisions on?
Yeah.
How reliable is carbon-14 dating, or any of the other older dating techniques? And when you dig up a piece of potsherd, how do you know how old it is? And what the other evidence is for what these people were like. I mean, they're gone, they're dead. How can bones fossilize, but behavior doesn't fossilize? So how do you infer behavior? Well, cave paintings and symbols on the cave paintings, or symbols on pottery, and things like that. So there's a lot of inferential science going on there, and so it's all of these topics are a way, like in my class, to say, how do scientists know anything? And then you're often talking about the scientific method without actually saying that.
Yeah. So you teach Skepticism 101. So can we talk a little bit about sort of what is skepticism as like a way of thinking, or a toolkit for understanding the world? Like, how would you define what skepticism and the goals of, skeptical thinking are?
Yeah, I like that toolkit. I mean, that's a good metaphor. I mean, it's a set of tools that we use to evaluate claims. Mm-hmm. And really, skepticism is just science. All scientists are skeptics, and they're skeptical of claims. And the reason for that is because most ideas that people come up with are wrong. And even scientists, one of the jobs of a scientist is to throw out hypotheses to try to figure out some problem. Could be this, could be A, B, C, D, E, and you just throw them out, see what sticks, see what sounds reasonable to your colleagues, what has evidence, what doesn't have evidence, what you can run an experiment on to test, these sorts of things. And so, science begins with the null hypothesis, which is that your hypothesis is not true. So if you say, well, I have a cure for AIDS, the FDA is not going to just give you a patent on your claim because you have an anecdote or testimonial.
Give it a year or two.
Yeah. Well, that's another story. I mean, maybe they're too cautious. Maybe they're not cautious enough. But in any case, you actually have to present your evidence. Where's your epidemiological studies? Where's your double-blind tests that you ran or whatever? And we're not going to believe it until you provide that. So and that applies to everything. It's Bigfoot. Maybe there might be a Bigfoot. Show me the body, and I'll believe. But until then, I'm going to be skeptical.
That's what I didn't. I didn't hear anything about Bigfoot coming out during the solar eclipse this week. I thought that was supposed to.
Yes, that's right. And I was in Oregon for that, so that's where Bigfoot,
right?
But he wasn't at the parking lot at the original Pancake House. So, what can I say? I didn't see him.
Yeah. So I think like the next place maybe I'd like to go is something that, came out, I guess, and I know you've talked about this a lot on other podcasts and everything too, but, the idea of this conceptual penis hoax.
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh. Can we talk about that? So, Dan, do you want to kind of lead into a question on this?
And I know, just for a little bit of background, this was I guess you were involved on this, so I guess I can just kind of let you set up and explain like the background and the purpose of it.
So Pete Boghossian and James Lindsay wrote the paper and submitted it to a couple of journals. I didn't know about any of that. I didn't even know they had done this until just Pete told me one day, hey, we got it. We got this paper and it's going to be published, and would you like to publish our expose explaining why we did it? It's like, okay. So we did. And I was always intrigued by the original big hoax back in 1994, where Alan Sokal, wrote Transgressing the Boundaries, sort of faux lit crit type quantum physics paper. And at the time, he was hammered pretty hard for that. Severely criticized. Like, this doesn't prove anything. Mm-hmm. And now he's kind of elevated as this hero. Like, this was a great thing that he did because the lit crit studies have gotten out of hand too far with the language and sciencey sounding jargon. So I always thought that had a useful, I guess, lesson for everybody. And so when Pete did that, I thought, I don't know James Lindsay, but Pete's a pretty good friend. So I thought, that's I like that. So we published the expose, and some people thought it was great. Some people thought it was terrible. The reviews were pretty mixed, I have to say. I didn't do a count anywhere, but my sense was pretty split. Maybe, I don't know, 50-50, whatever. And there was much criticism about what the journal was. How good was the journal? Okay, was it a paper play journal? No, but it wasn't a very high ranked journal. It wasn't even a gender studies journal. It's a social science journal. And how hard is it really to get something published in a lower tier journal? Probably not that hard. But to me, none of that really mattered, because what mattered, it could have been published in the Onion, as far as I'm concerned. It's that. You can't tell the difference between that, passages from that paper and passages from so-called real papers. So in my little explanation I wrote of why we published the expose was at the same time, or just before that paper came out, was the feminist glaciology paper, which when I read that, I thought, oh, this has got to be an Onion thing or something, or it's a hoax. I thought it was a hoax before the Boghossian paper, and it turns out that's not a hoax. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the point. If you can't tell whether a paper is real or not, then what's really going on here? So anyway, that's it's not the kind of thing we want to do. Probably won't do it again. I'm not into hoaxing journal editors. I'm an editor. I'd be a little pissed off maybe if somebody hoaxed me. So that isn't really the point. It isn't to try to trick editors at all. It's the sort of larger use of language and the clarity of language and how important that is. Anyway, that was it.
Yeah, go ahead. And the paper itself, if you read it on its own, like, I will agree with you. If anybody who spent any amount of time like on the site Tumblr reading a lot of I guess what people would refer to as like extreme, like social justice warrior type speak, it certainly does read that way, and I think it is an excellent piece of satire. And I don't know the outrage or what the reason people are upset. I don't think is because the paper was written. I think it's because what happened was in the Skeptic magazine article that I read here, is we took the paper, it was published in a journal that has no impact factor. It is pay to play. It is one of those predatory journals, and instead of saying this is what happened, we got it published and leaving it at that, I feel like a lot of the claims and statements that were made don't necessarily line up with what actually happened, or just we don't have that supporting evidence there. So I feel like it's slightly intellectually dishonest to say that it shows that there is this massive problem in the realm of gender study in gender studies journals, and I feel like it does a lot to. I understand what you're saying. It's a lot of these papers. Like I hadn't heard of the glacial, the glaciers, gender in science. I think is what it is. I just looked it up here, and it talks about glaciers as, and somehow I haven't had a chance to read it, obviously, since we're here. But that seems like it might be an entertaining read. But I think the problem we run into is we're saying that this, under the two-prong thing that we have, one for, predatory journals, and of course the whole backstory of how it was submitted to one journal, then referred out to this other one, and that I absolutely agree looks really shady. But the main problem is we're taking something that happened and then saying something else happened whenever we have evidence or don't have that evidence. And I feel like it's similar to a climate change denier saying, well, it's cold outside today, so that means global warming isn't true. I feel like it's not connecting the right dots in order to be able to support that.
Okay. Well, first, I don't think the journal is a predatory journal. I think it was above that, but below most respectable journals.
They did pay what, like $600, I think, or something.
Yeah, they never paid anything. Pete told me they never. I mean, they sent a bill and never wanted to collect or anything. I don't know. Maybe it's just super sloppiness. Yeah.
Right, and I know that's not your side, and of course you can't speak to that. But I feel like that argument as well. We didn't pay anything. Well, they billed you for it. There was an expectation of payment, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. So, but let's pull back for a second. Like the feminist glacier paper. Okay, I'm not really sure I understood it that well reading it. It's like, okay, what are they really trying to say here? Mm-hmm. But then somebody pointed me to a TED talk the lead author gave on this, and it's a pretty good talk. I mean, she makes the point that most of the studies done on glaciers over the past 2 centuries are by men, and that maybe women would come at it a different way. Okay, all right, that's I can see where that would happen more, say, in the social sciences, and maybe some of the biological sciences, maybe less so than in the physical sciences. I don't know. Brett Weinstein makes an interesting point about that in a recent video he made. He's the guy from Evergreen. Yeah. And he's pretty sympathetic to liberal progressive causes and so on. And so anyway, he made an interesting point. Like, for example, why do bowerbirds build these big blue nests? And and so a male biologist might go, well, because want to attract females, because that's what we guys do. Whereas a female may have a different perspective. Anyway, that was his point. I thought, yeah, okay, all right, sure. But I think a lot of the reasonable points that some of these gender studies papers may be making get lost in the jargon, and I think it's a little different than, say, the jargon you'd see in, say, a quantum physics paper. They're like, I wouldn't know that Alan Sokal wrote a hoax paper unless he told me it was a hoax paper. Mm-hmm. In the parts where he's talking about quantum physics, because I don't even understand quantum physics, so how would I know it's made up? But I think the gender and also the lit crit language and jargon and stuff is obfuscating enough. It's not helping its own cause by making points that, say, in that TED talk seem kind of reasonable. Like, okay, I can see that point.
Yeah. I guess the thing that was, disheartening in a sense when all of this was coming out and being talked about, And, the people that we talk to might be different than the people you talk to, with it. But I feel like a lot of the feedback and what I felt was that it seemed like there was this, like we pulled one over on this particular field, of gender studies. And I'm not an expert in gender studies. That's not my realm. But at the same time, it was this, like, they got a bullshit paper published. Read it. It looks like it does read like The Onion, but I felt like
funny. I mean, it's like funny. We got to recognize that.
It's ridiculous, and it's
for
like
what it is.
For satire, it is. But it was that sort of, I want to say, self-congratulatory feeling that went along with it. That it's like, oh man, it doesn't feel good in the name of skepticism. That it's like, kind of get what I'm saying here. Like it just,
I do.
It felt sort of embarrassing in a way, and I don't know.
Okay.
So that I guess.
Alan Sokol wrote a nice piece for us here. Let me find what he said here that I thought was pretty clever. That if you reversed it, so he writes here, it indeed seems likely that at Cogent Social Sciences, the journal in question, the flattery of the editor's moral and ideological preconceptions helped to dull their critical faculties and smooth the way to publication of a grossly deficient manuscript. To be sure, Boghossian and Lindsay did not carry out a controlled experiment, but suppose they had. Imagine they had selected a sample of lower-tiered sociology or gender studies journals and then sent to a randomly chosen half of them an article contending with equally flimsy arguments that toxic hyperfemininity is the conceptual driver behind much of climate change. For example, and then Sokol makes up something that that maybe would run the experiment here, that you might send in. Toxic hyperfemininity leads to a rampant consumerism and profligate overconsumption of superfluous luxury goods, for they are luxuries to the overwhelming majority of humankind, principally apparel, cosmetics, and celebrity magazines. While some of this excess is sustainably recycled via donations of last year's fashion to charity shops, the vast majority ends up unused in closets, to the annoyance of male partners who urgently require the space for sporting equipment and pornographic magazines, or in landfills, or is exported to developing countries by predatory pseudo-charities undermining the local clothing manufacturers. Furthermore, 30% of non-biodegradable waste in landfills is composed of disposable diapers, which are a direct consequence of toxic hyperfemininity via its exploitation of male sexual weakness. In all these ways, the conceptual vagina, a performative social construct that is isomorphic to an especially toxic strain of femininity, is revealed as the conceptual driver behind much of climate change. Full stop. And then Sokol asks, would a modified article along these lines have fared as well as the original? I doubt it. And that's the point. Now, so without running that experiment, which would tell us something, then we don't really know what the hoax paper did. But you see his point. That if you flip the gender and reverse the logic, then probably most journals would reject it because they have a certain particular perspective.
Yeah.
But see, just my problem there though is there was a, and of course I don't know that this came from you. I've only heard some interviews with the actual writers of the paper, but they like continuously make that point that, well, this proves that there's this big underlying problem, and we could have published it in a more prestigious journal. We could have written it toned it down a little bit, but we didn't. But if they had, yeah. I know you didn't write it, and that's again, I feel like we're grossly overstating whatever, for lack of a better word, accomplishment that was made with that, by saying that, well, had we done this, well, you literally had the infinite amount of time, to try again and do that. So I feel like it would have been a much stronger argument had it been published in something that was actually had any semblance of journal that had any semblance of credibility.
Maybe that's why people like the so-called hoax in the long run. But again, I remember when that happened. We were just a couple of years into the publication of Skeptic magazine, and so-called got hammered pretty hard by academics across the board. I remember Stephen Jay Gould was really critical of it, and now people kind of look back on it as like, oh yeah, that was a great hoax. Well, why? What's the difference? And I guess maybe it's the quality of the journal, because I don't know if you could say that the Allen so-called hoax worked in any quantifiable way. I mean, did it change the structure or nature of lit crit journals? Did they become more rigorous, or did they become less obfuscatory in their jargon and language? I don't know. I've never checked, but I don't think anyone has. But so it's not even clear in so-called's own article for us that he thinks that hoax papers work. He said it kind of did, kind of didn't. The most recent one, it mostly didn't work. That was his opinion, and we published that. I didn't tell him what he should say about it. And so I don't know. I'm not sure even what the criteria would be for judging whether a paper worked or not based on subsequent journal articles, or I don't know.
Well, and I guess I feel like we have two cars that are racing against one another. One of them is a junker, one of them is a sports car, and the person driving the junker is saying, "Well, if I had a better car, I would have won." Well, no shit, you would have won because you have a better product. You have something that actually can get you there, and I feel like that's what's happening here is after the fact, we're saying, well, this I would have won if XYZ would have happened, but the fact is it didn't happen, and that's not there, and I just don't feel like it's very representative. And like I said earlier, I feel like it's intellectually dishonest to make those claims based on what was said.
You can have Pete or Lindsay. I guess Lindsay's been doing a number of podcasts. I don't know if Pete's done any interviews about it, but Pete does a lot of podcasts.
Twitter said he's going underground for a while for a book or something.
Yeah. Anyway, so, but to pull back even bigger, the subject of gender studies and all that, in a way, it is part of moral progress that I wrote about in the moral arc. That is, the recognition of bias in a society is the first step in changing it. You have to realize what the problem is, and so to that extent, that that gender studies articles that identify these forms of bias. For example, resumes are sent out, one with a male name, one with a female name, or journal articles are like in physics are published. Some have a male name, one the exact same paper, one has a male name, the other a female name. They're differential rates of publication or citation and so on based, so, and it's clear that there's still some bias even in academia, which I find startling, because academia is now full of liberals, people that were raised like I was in the 60s and 70s and 80s to be sensitive to these sorts of things. These are the very people that should be going out of their way because they verbalize overtly that they're liberal, progressive, they support women's rights and so on, and try actively not to discriminate, and yet it still appears to be happening. So. But the question is for me is, yes, of course, it's never going to be zero, but is it getting better? And I think it's getting better. I think today's conservatives are more socially liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. Maybe not economically conservative. They have the differences in tax preferences and things like that are still there. But socially, how gays are treated, women are treated, and so on, is much better today than it was. And so one of my concerns about the search for discrimination and bias and so on is finding it when it's not actually there. That is, just the constant hype about how terrible things are. Much of it, I think, is driven by, current events is driven by Trump's the election and Trump's victory. And people are saying, oh, look, it's just as bad as it's ever been, or we're on this long-term slide for years. And wait a minute, if Hillary had won, And would we even be talking about any of this? I mean, wouldn't we be saying, look, things have been progressively getting better, and look, now we have a woman president following a black president. See, things are getting better. But because of this, Trump winning, it kind of feels to a lot of people like not just a step backwards, but like it's pulling the past along with it. Like this bias against women and immigrants and so on, all that, it has been there all along. I don't think so. And then finally, I guess the thing that concerns me about that's sort of what somebody called the oppression Olympics. I don't know who coined that, but this constant search for who's the most victimized group. The fact is, there are victims, real victims, and everybody is a victim of something. Now most of us in the modern world are not victims like anything at all, like what it would have been centuries ago, or if you lived in Syria or Somalia or North Korea now. Most of us don't experience anything like that, and this constant, sort of quest for finding, ever increasingly smaller forms of discrimination or whatever, makes you feel like a victim, and being a victim makes you weak. Everybody could be a victim of something if you go in search of it, and so this is sort of my own pet peeve about worrying about people that are always on the lookout for slights, and even when people say some guy says something to a woman in the office or whatever, maybe he didn't mean it that way, but if you're searching for it, or you spin it or turn it into something that's negative, I think that doesn't help. I think it can go too far.
So
I mean, I was going to say there. I mean, there are certainly examples of people who get easily offended or are, like you were kind of saying, are looking for a reason to be upset, to get upset, to have that victim role. And I think a lot of that has to do. And that I feel like, one, that's the minority by far. They're just a loud minority, so that's why we think it's such a prevalent problem. But two, I think that's just a search for attention, just wanting to get attention any way you possibly can. So I don't think we disagree there. On that.
That's true. And I would add with the Evergreen example we talked about. There was maybe 200 students in those videos that are all over the place, screaming and shouting and protesting and marching and all that. But there's 5,000 students there. So where were the other 4,800? In their dorms, studying, just being normal students. So it could be all of this is just blowing completely out of proportion just by the fact that the media covers things that happen, not things that don't happen. I mean, no one's gonna take YouTube videos of students in a library quietly studying and go, look, here's another day at Evergreen without a protest. It's only when people go crazy and start filming, when like the neo-Nazis at Charlottesville. Oh my gosh, how many of these people are there? I don't think there's very many at all. But they get the most attention. That Vice segment film has been viewed like 50 million times now. That nut job with all the guns and stuff, and it makes it seem like they're in every neighborhood, and I don't think so.
Yeah. See, and I guess I just wonder too, where just looking at skepticism as an idea and a toolkit and something that hopefully everybody wants to use critical thinking and everything to make the world kind of a better place, right? In a sense, we know Bigfoot doesn't exist. We, hopefully one day we won't have like stupid shit like homeopathy and alternative medicine running people's lives. But I'm wondering at this point, how can we use some of the critical thinking tools and all of that to intersect with the social justice type of world and those kind of issues? Because I don't know. I'm just kind of feeling like
it's a super hard question to answer, because if you look at the history of the skeptical movement, it started off just debunking psychics and that sort of thing, and it's mostly focused on the paranormal, pseudoscience, but like I have a quarterly magazine to pump out every 3 months. I have a
Mhm.
column in Scientific American. I got to write every month. Got to come up with new topics, right? So we've all kind of expanded our sphere of what we're going to incorporate, and also what's out there. That's like vaccines. Okay, now vaccines is a thing because there's anti-vaxxers. Okay, now that's kind of in our wheelhouse, but that didn't used to be the case, and so on. And then you start bumping into religion. Okay, so after Richard's book, Dawkins, the God Delusion, that kind of hyped everybody up into making skepticism, making the criticism of religion part of skepticism, where that used to be not the case. It used to be part of humanism, and humanism's attacks on religion were not on the existence of God or any of that kind of stuff so much as it was like women's reproductive rights and abortion issues and taking care of the homeless and free speech and separation from church and state, those sorts of things. So I guess the problem is a division of labor. What is it that so-called skeptics should be doing? Should we be involved in social justice issues involving politics? And I say, why not? I mean, we should just do whatever, where we can apply science and critical thinking and reason to all issues. But here, clearly, we see that whereas we'd all agree on Bigfoot and psychics or whatever, we're definitely not in agreement about social justice issues. And clearly there's a huge division there.
And I think that's where maybe when this hoax paper came out, and it seemed to be really picking at this particular area that I think could then translate to social justice and all of that kind of thing. Like to say, whatever, we pulled one over on the gender and women's studies field. Like, I think that possibly alienated, in a sense, some of the people who cross over between skepticism and social justice and want to apply skepticism for a greater good. But I think that's where there was some disappointment in people speaking out because like fuck Bigfoot, that's done.
Right.
How can we?
Well, and that's how you're gonna even you see that with a lot of I feel like a lot of atheist type personalities on YouTube and wherever it's you can only talk about how gods don't exist so much before it gets boring. There's only so many.
That's right. I know.
There's only so many ways to say, well, this is the fucking dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Yes.
And before you go, well, okay, now we can talk about all these other things, and then I feel like that kind of blends into humanism, because I feel like humanism and atheism are two different things.
I recommend to your followers, your viewers, that they go to skeptic.com and read Alan Sokal's reflective paper on what hoaxes mean, and it's very thoughtful. I mean, he's it's like it could do this, could do that. This is good. This is not good. I think it's very balanced. He was somewhat praiseworthy of the Lindsay Lagosian hoax, but then he said, "Well, but I think it didn't really work the way they think it did." Okay, fair enough. And maybe there's certain things we can't resolve through science. I mean, I like to think there's nothing we can't resolve, but could be there are. Like what's the right system of taxes? How do we deal with poverty? I don't know. There's free will determinism. I mean, there's certain things maybe we just can't. How do you know what's right and wrong? These are some of the big issues that skeptics definitely disagree about, politically, metaphysically, whatever, philosophically. That maybe no evidence is going to resolve. Like where 99% of skeptics all agree, like Bigfoot doesn't exist. That this is the proper role of social justice. Whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. No,
do you know? I'm sorry. Do you know? Before they published this, or even whenever before the article came out, do we know? Did they talk to anybody that was at all actually in the field of gender studies, like any academics in the field?
That I don't know. Pete's at Portland State in philosophy. Okay. Lindsay, I don't know. I actually don't know much about James Lindsay. I think he's a mathematician, so I don't know. But I mean, Sokal, he didn't. I doubt he studied lit crit field very extensively. He just read enough to know how to make up sentences.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think you have to be an expert in it to. And if you're going to write, a critical piece about gender studies, like a reflective, nonfiction, non-hoax paper, yeah, you should know something about it. I'm not sure why that would matter for hoaxing. I mean, if the people in the real field can't tell.
But that's part of the problem is people in the real field didn't have a chance to review it in the first place. But the other,
all right, yeah.
But the other argument that the other argument there is we're overstating what like the significance of the accomplishment, and especially by not including, because I imagine had they included that would, in all the interviews they've done, something would have been said about that. So I'm confident in my statement that I don't think they consulted anybody.
Probably not. Yeah, probably not. But if you take, back to the slightly bigger picture again, and take the Brett Weinstein case at Evergreen. Where are these students getting this idea that he's a racist? Self-identifies as progressive, deeply progressive, he said. And gave examples in a long interview with Joe Rogan about what he's actually done in his life to help oppress minorities and so on. Okay, it's very moving. And here is these students are surrounding him, calling him a racist. Where are they getting this? Okay, well, in part it's from their own professors who have been telling them, there is entrenched racism. It is so deep, it's institutionalized. The white guys don't even know that they're racist. And Brett Weinstein can stand there and say, I'm not a racist, but we know he is because whatever. And this is the concern, is that, again, you're finding stuff that isn't really there. This guy is on your he's on your team, he's on your side. And this is the concern a lot of us have. It's gone too far.
I think there is something to say that if the person who says, I don't see race, I'm colorblind, is either stupid or lying, because everybody is, like, whether we want to or not, everybody has a little bit of implicit racism. I listened to a NPR podcast recently about that topic, and one of the examples that at least really spoke to me, and this was recommended by Jessica Blumenke-Greif from Friendly Atheist podcast when we had her on, was had this gentleman on the show talk about this time where he saw a African American walking down the street and thought, well, I'm going to watch him just to be safe, or just to make sure that nothing happens, just to just in case, because we have this just inherently, without even consciously thinking, this person, is more likely to cause a crime or to be violent with somebody. And of course, like, the story progresses, and he caught himself doing that and said, what the fuck is wrong with me? And kind of the rest of the episode works through that. But I think to say that racism doesn't exist, or there's, to a certain extent, it's demonstrable that African Americans, people of color, are treated differently by the legal system than white people. I don't think that's just a fact. So to say that it's not institutionalized to some extent, and to say that racism doesn't exist for most people is just simply, I think, not true.
I think the way I would phrase it would be that yes, it's true that probably most of us harbor all kinds of assumptions about other people. It's just the way our brains are wired up, to classify things into categories. It's just what we do, and that includes people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The question is, what do you actually do about that? What do you do with it? Does it really alter your behavior?
I think part of the problem is denying that it exists in the first place, though, by saying that, well, it's not institutionalized, or it's an overblown problem. I think that in itself is a problem, because as shitty as AA is, they at least got that right. First up is admitting you have a problem. So I think we have to at least admit that there is a problem in the first place. In order for us
okay. So, but let's move away from it's black and white. Everything is racist. Nothing's racist, or everyone's a racist.
No, I didn't say everybody's a racist.
I know you're not. But I know you're not. But we should all just sort of do a little check on that. Say, okay, that's true.
No, I feel you on that part, because I think just big picture talking, we are there are definitely issues right now where nuance is lost in the discussion. unfortunately. And so, yeah, like,
I don't know if you knew, and maybe we should have said this before we invited you on the show. We are Nazis. Like, I didn't know that because we think we shouldn't punch people based on ideological differences. But things like that. Things like that. I mean, that absolutely exists, and there are people that say everybody they disagree with is a Nazi. Everybody who doesn't, everybody's racist, or all white people are racist, or you can't be racist against white people, or whatever it is. But that, again, like, that's such a small minority, and kind of tying that into the paper, and I feel like the point that was kind of being made there is yes, it exists, and it's a problem, but it's not necessarily as rampant of a problem as what we perceive it as, just because we, of course, as we tend to remember things that, negative experiences or things like
right.
that. So I think it's perceived as a larger issue whenever we, hear or say, or hear people say, rather, everybody's racist, everybody's Nazi, or whatever.
Yeah, again, back to my previous point, conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s. By that I mean socially liberal. Mm-hmm. Like, just take someone like Donald Sterling, the Clippers owner, LA Clippers owner. He made these disparaging remarks about African Americans in the context of his mistress, taking pictures with African American ball players at the games and so on, so he loses his franchise and so on, and he's vilified. Okay, but in the 1950s, most old guys thought like that. My father, I had two fathers, a bio dad and stepdad. They were probably both definitely more, say, racist than I am, and I'm probably more racist than my kids, and so on. I mean, it's sort of a generational thing, and in a way, you can kind of predict a lot of these racial attitudes based on when someone was born. Are you a silent generation? Are you a baby boomer? Are you a Gen X, millennial, whatever? And what that's tracking, these are proxies for the larger cultural zeitgeist shift toward not being that way. And it's not just so much, first you change behavior, but then you change thoughts. My example of this is witch burning. It's illegal to burn women for cavorting with Satan in the middle of the night. Okay, it's illegal. You can't do it. But I don't need it to be illegal, because it never even enters my mind to do that, because I don't believe in demons and Satans and so on. So ultimately, that's where we want to get. We're not there with, say, race, but we're a lot further than we were 2 centuries ago, a century ago, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. And so, yeah. Anyway, so
and regarding that, I mean, it just is one of those topics right now that's so much on the forefront with, like, what happened in Charlottesville and all, and just everything. And I mean, do you think that it is a product of this sort of Trump presidency / like regime of just?
I think regime is the right word you want to use there.
I kind of had to, but do you think that that's partially to blame for just how much it's out there?
It certainly makes us notice it more, because it's everyone's talking about this stuff, and then that hypes up few of these people. Again, how many of these crazy Nazi people are there? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to say, because
I mean, how many do there need to be in? Becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if it was like 20% of all Americans agree that what some of these guys were saying about Jews and blacks and so on, then it would still be a big problem. I don't think it's 20%. I don't think it's 2%. I think it's like 0.02%. I think some of these wingnuts they just like to go out and march and stir up trouble. And so it's not that. Again, I think had Hillary won, we wouldn't even be talking about any of this stuff. But those people would still be there, because the alt-right has been around for decades. They were just called something different. It's not a Trump phenomenon. I mean, you go back to the 90s when I was doing stuff on the Holocaust deniers, and, who are these people? Well, a lot of them are these sort of far-right economic nationalists, racial nationalists, and so on, saying a lot of, like Pat Buchanan, Patrick Buchanan, sort of an economic nationalist. A lot of these guys had what we would today call the alt-right. And they were much more prominent then. And it was a little bit like the militias became really big after Waco and Ruby Ridge in the early 90s. And it's like, yeah, but we're going to stand up to the government. We're going to arm ourselves to the teeth, and we're going to fight back. And then Oklahoma City bombing happens, and boom, that was the end of that. The militias just basically disbanded. No one wanted anything to do with them because, you know, this is what it could lead to. I'm not sure Charlottesville will be the Oklahoma City bombing ending of the current neo-Nazi alt-right movement. Maybe there needs to be more carnage. I don't know. But basically the idea is that when extremists go too far, the support they might have had from the centrists will go away, and then they're left unmoored, and then they just disappear. And I think that's what will happen with these people. Again, I don't think it's that many. To whatever extent they had some support from people more in the sort of mainstream right, I think that's now dwindling because, again, that Vice video, 50 million people saw that, and you could see what these guys are just insane.
They're out of their minds.
Out of their minds. No one wants to do anything with them.
No, it was terrifying to watch some of that and just see that these are people that hold these really extreme and scary ideologies. And I guess to see things like that, to see what, you know, just some of what's out there in the world right now in terms of ideas. And I think that the goal of, I mean, I guess us and all, you know, people on hopefully the right side of things is to spread good ideas, critical thinking, all of that. And I think that's, again, part of the skeptics toolkit is to do what we can to help spread good ideas and taking into account the different elements of the, you know, political, social climate. I guess what I want to end on is asking you, what do you think the future of sort of the skeptical movement looks like, and how could that positively impact the world we're living in?
I guess just first of all, the demographics. I mean, when I got into it, I mean, we started Skeptic magazine 25 years ago this year. It's our 25th anniversary. And then it was pretty much old white guys complaining about the world. You know, there wasn't a lot of women, and there's still not a lot of people of color, but even that's starting to change now. So I think as the demographic shift comes over the decades, you'll just see more women, more youth, more minorities, people of color, and so on. But even that's not quite what I'd like to see, which is that everybody should be skeptical. I mean, these are tools everybody should use. Don't call yourself a skeptic. Just I'm a critical thinker, and I think like a scientist. This is, you know, what I try to teach my students at my Skepticism 101 class at Chapman is like, this is for everybody, not just for people who are skeptics. There really, in that sense, there really is no such thing. It's just like everybody should be a critical thinker. You know, whether you're buying a car, voting for a politician, deciding about an economic policy or foreign policy, to whatever extent we can apply the tools of science and reason to coming up with an answer, even if we don't agree on the answer. So, I mean, one of the things about democracy is why Jefferson called it an experiment, is because no one knows how to run a country or a society. So we have to do it together in kind of a real time, constantly changing the variables. And that's what democracy is. And so we can have 50 different experiments like we have in America. Like, so we have 50 different states. They all have their own state constitution. And all the constitutions are a little bit different. These are experiments. So 2 side-by-side states have different gun control laws. Okay, well, we can study that and try to control for other variables, poverty or whatever, and then see what the outcomes are in terms of number of homicides, number of gun homicides, gun suicides, and gun accidents, and see what the effects of gun control laws are, which is why I changed my mind. I used to be against gun control, then I decided, nope, I think we need some gun control. I used to be for the death penalty, sort of. Now I'm against the death penalty. Again, just by looking at the evidence and data and so on, there's certain principles behind it too. Do I really want the state to have that much power that could kill people? Anyway, so but even if you and I can't agree on gun control or abortion or the death penalty, we should at least agree there's a method by which you and I can arrive at our own conclusions and then agree to disagree, because that's the only way and not have violence enter into the equation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that respectful dialogue and, engagement like that, and again, I've we have been called not very nice names because we say, like, let's not be violent with people and let's talk and do all that, ridiculous stuff. But I think that, being able to communicate with people who have different worldviews, even within the sort of skeptic community, I think as many conversations as can be had about things like conceptual penis hoaxes, I think just having the conversations is important, and that's a big part of
I agree.
This whole world.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you coming on and talking to us tonight about all this stuff.
Yeah, I don't want your listeners to think, I mean, Skeptic Magazine is now the official publication of all hoaxes. I mean, it's just one thing we did in 25 years. We're not going to do anything like that again.
Right.
It's not a thing to do over and over. It just, okay, now we're on to the next thing.
Yeah, and we didn't intend on spending so much time.
Oh, it's okay. I don't mind.
But to read, see, hear more about your work, can they go to do that?
Skeptic.com is our webpage for the magazine and the society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, so you can support us through Skeptic.com, and michaelshermer.com is my personal webpage, and of course my books are on Amazon and all that. So and actually Skeptic's in every bookstore in North America, so you can go by and grab one. I think the current issue has Bill Nye on the cover, and that might have been the previous issue. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. And
you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
We're all in this together.
Yes. All right. So Dan's going to stop the recording, and then we'll just wait for everything